I'd like to welcome all of you to the 16th Annual Center on Rights Development Spring Symposium. The Center on Rights Development, or CORD, is the oldest center at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. What makes CORD unique is that, other than me, the entire staff and programs are run by Corbell students. CORD picks a new theme each year based on one of the three pillars of human rights. We use the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, known as the ICESCR. We always do the ICESCR and then we can't remember what it actually stands for usually when we're having these discussions. The ICESCR is probably the least known of the three major human rights documents that make up what is known as the International Bill of Human Rights. The others being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. But the ICESCR is filled with grand human rights aspirations, and I recommend it to you as a good read, although sometimes difficult to figure out what its intentions are. In past years, CORD has focused on such themes as the right to health in emergency settings, the right to water, and the right to education. Next year, CORD's theme will be centered around gender rights. This year, my colleagues have put together an amazing symposium, Sovereign and Sacred, Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice, with national and international experts presenting for the next few days. Please take a good look and a careful look at the symposium flyer, which you have, for panel titles, days, and times. Our closing keynote will be President Alejandro Toledo of Peru on Friday at 5 p.m. And if you would like to attend, please do not forget to RSVP. You'll need to go to CORD's website for instructions. That will be very helpful. I am very pleased to introduce to you our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and a part Indian mother. She has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues, and is co-founder and representative of the Indigenous World Association for Human Rights Work at the United Nations. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward. I actually looked for myself at that program at one point in my career, and helped found the Department of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. Her 1977 book, The Great Sioux Nation, was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of Americas held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz is the author or editor of 7 other books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and a memoir trilogy. Her most recent book is An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. She lives in San Francisco and organizes everywhere. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz.
Can you hear me? Is the microphone working? Okay, good. Because I have a very soft voice, so if you can't hear me, let me know. Well, I want to thank the Center for Human Rights Development that I have to get used to calling CORD because I can't remember what it means if I call it CORDs. Here at the University of Denver, I believe I was here in the 80s when I was doing work with refugees in Central America, and it's so good to be back and to see how it's developed in such a profound way and very more important now than ever. So I'm really grateful to be invited to be the keynote speaker at this 16th Annual Rights Symposium. I especially want to thank Symposium Coordinator Kristen Renda for her tireless work and support. I just saw a tiny bit of it myself, but I knew that was going on with everyone. She's wonderful. And thank all of you for being here this evening. After the decade of the 1960s, as a student and activist and a university professor, I became involved in the international human rights field as Native Americans and other indigenous peoples sought redress at the United Nations, beginning in the mid-1970s. And since that time, this has been my vocation. Never paid, by the way, vocation is an unpaid word, and the heart of my continued social justice activism. This evening, I want to focus on the source of United States predatory militarism in the world today, which I argue is the principal barrier to achieving justice here and in the world, as well as preventing the demise of humanity due to imminent destruction of our habitat. And this is based on the continued overconsumption, also of ourselves, that is inseparable from the US military dominance in the world today. So I've titled this talk tonight, Native American Nations Survival and the Future of the United States. And I would add the future of humanity. Some 200 miles southeast of Denver, an unforgettable incident occurred at the end of the war in 1864. It was not singular, rather very common from the time of first settlement at Jamestown through the founding of the United States Empire and throughout the 19th century in North America. But there was something about it that sears the brain, perhaps because it was during the Civil War and the Colorado Volunteers had been commissioned by the War Department. There was an extensive investigation that details the gruesome sadism that took place. And unlike thousands of other such US military massacres, it was not recorded as a battle, such as the Wounded Knee and Washita massacres and others were. Still in US Army annals, those were battles won. Preoccupied with the Civil War in the East, the Lincoln administration did little to prevent vicious and even genocidal actions on the part of territorial authorities, consisting of volunteer Indian haters, such as Kit Carson in the New Mexico Territory. And that refers, of course, to the forced relocation of the people of the Navajo Nation, 4 years incarceration. Half the people died during that time. The mood of maintaining settler law and order set the pattern for post-war genocide. In the most infamous incident involving militias, the 1st and 3rd Colorado Volunteers carried out the Sand Creek Massacre. Although assigned to guard the road to Santa Fe from Denver, the units mainly engaged in raiding and looting indigenous communities. John Shivington, an ambitious Colorado Territory politician known as the Fighting Parson, led the 3rd Colorado. By 1861, displaced and captive Cheyenne and Arapaho people, under the leadership of the great peace seeker Black Kettle, were incarcerated in a US military reservation called Sand Creek, near Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado Territory. They camped under a white flag of truce and had federal permission to hunt buffalo to feed themselves. In early 1864, the Colorado territorial governor informed them that they could no longer leave the reservation to hunt. Despite their compliance with the order, Shivington took 700 Colorado volunteers to the reservation. Without provocation or warning, they attacked, leaving dead 105 women and children and 28 men. Later, the Federal Commissioner of Indian Affairs would denounce the action, saying that the people had been, quote, butchered in cold blood by troops in the service of the United States. In its 1865 investigation, the Congress Joint Committee on the conduct of the Civil War, recorded testimonies, and published a report that documented the aftermath of the killings, when Shivington and his volunteers burned all the teepees and stole horses. Worse, after the smoke cleared, they had returned and finished off the injured, while scalping and mutilating the corpses, women and men, young and old, children and babies. Then they decorated their weapons and caps with body parts, fetuses, penises, breasts, and vulvas. And in the words of Acoma poet Simon Ortiz, stuck them on their hats to dry, their fingers greasy and slick. Once back in Denver, they displayed the trophies to the adoring public in Denver's Apollo Theater and in saloons. Yet despite the detailed reports of the deeds, neither Shivington nor any of his men were reprimanded or prosecuted, signaling a free field for killing. The Cheyenne survivors of the massacre, which included the leader Black Kettle and his wife, were relocated to Indian Territory on a small reservation alongside the Washita River, not far from where I grew up, where 2 days after the 4th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre, Colonel George Armstrong Custer tried to eliminate the surviving Cheyenne. When Black Kettle, who had survived Sand Creek, received word that mounted troops of the 7th Cavalry were leaving their fort and headed for the Cheyenne Reservation, he and his wife rode out at dawn in a snowstorm, unarmed, hoisting a white flag. Custer ordered the soldiers to fire, and a moment later, Black Kettle and his wife lay dead. The 7th Cavalry continued on to the unarmed Cheyenne settlement and murdered over 100 Cheyenne women and children and men, taking ghoulish trophies afterwards. In U.S. annals, that massacre is listed as the successful Battle of Washita. Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird writes that the colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands provide the United States the economic and material resources needed to cast its imperialist gaze globally, is a fact that is simultaneously obvious within and yet continually obscured by what is essentially a settler colony's national construction of itself as an ever more perfect, multicultural, multiracial democracy. The status of American Indians as sovereign nations colonized by the United States continues to haunt. Well, the conventional narrative of U.S. history routinely segregates the Indian Wars as a subspecialization within the dubious category of the West. But the architecture of U.S. world dominance was designed and tested by the period of continental U.S. militarism from 1780 to 1890, the so-called Indian Wars. They started on the Atlantic coast. So if it's the West, it's the whole continent. Even at war during the 20th century, there was a continuation of counterinsurgency, the methods used. Central America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. The opening of the 21st century saw a new, even more brazen form of U.S. militarism and imperialism explode on the world, followed by 2 major military invasions and hundreds of small wars employing U.S. special forces around the globe. One highly regarded military analyst and counterinsurgency advocate argues that there are direct connections between the U.S. Indian Wars and what he considers the United States' bright imperialist past and future. Robert D. Kaplan, in his 2005 book, Imperial Grunts, presented several case studies that he considered highly successful operations. The first one may make you laugh, Yemen, Colombia, Mongolia, and the Philippines, in addition to ongoing complex projects in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and Iraq. While many U.S. citizens, probably everyone here, and many of our elected representatives called for ending the U.S. military interventions we knew about, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Kaplan hailed protracted and counterinsurgencies in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Pacific. He presented a guide for the U.S. controlling those areas of the world based on its having achieved continental dominance in North America by means of counterinsurgency and employing total and unlimited war. Kaplan became one of the principal intellectual boosters for U.S. power through the tried and true first way of war. This is the way of war dating to the British colonial period that military historian John Grenier describes as a combination of unlimited war and irregular war, a military tradition that accepts, legitimizes, and encourages attacks upon and the destruction of non-combatants, villages, and agricultural resources in shockingly violent campaigns to achieve their goals of conquest, unquote. That military historian, by the way, is a professor of military history at the U.S. Air Force Academy and is a U.S. Air Force officer. It's an interesting book, The First Way of War. Kaplan sums up his thesis in the prologue to his Imperial Grunts, which he subtitles Engine Country. He writes, by the turn of the 21st century, the United States military had already appropriated the entire earth and was ready to flood the most obscure areas of it with troops at a moment's notice. The Pentagon divided the planet into 5 area commands, similar to the way that the Indian country of the American Pacific had been divided in the mid-19th century by the U.S. Army. According to soldiers and Marines I met, Kaplan speaking, on the ground in far-flung corners of the earth, the comparison with the 19th century was apt. Welcome to Engine Country was the refrain I heard from troops from Colombia to the Philippines and in Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on terrorism was really about training the frontier, unquote. In short, the war on terror is another Indian war. This time, Arabs as the Indians. Kaplan goes on to ridicule elites in New York and Washington who debate imperialism in grand historical terms, while individuals from all the armed forces interpret policy according to the particular circumstances they face and are indifferent to or unaware of the fact that they are part of an imperialist project. To them, and for many U.S. Americans, United States military power is the heart of their patriotism, and the military is revered as no other governmental institution is. Pointing to the intentionality of U.S. colonialism in North America, Kaplan challenges the concept of manifest destiny, arguing that, quote, it was not inevitable that the United States should have an empire in the North American continent, unquote. Rather, he argues, it was the work of small groups of frontiersmen separated from each other by great distances. Here, Kaplan refers to what Grenier, the military historian, calls rangers, self-organized settlers who destroyed indigenous towns and fields and food supplies, murdering the inhabitants. The most famous organizer of rangers was, of course, the Tennessee militia under Andrew Jackson, the good deeds for which he became general in the U.S. Army and then president. Kaplan equates these settler vigilantes to the modern special forces, He acknowledges that the regular army provided lethal backup for settler counterinsurgency in slaughtering the buffalo, the food supply of the Plains people, as well as making continuous raids on settlements to kill or confine the families of the indigenous resistance fighters. Kaplan summarizes the genealogy of U.S. militarism today. Whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, when the evils of slavery and fascism were confronted and vanquished. For commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the U.S. Army's defining moment was fighting the Indians. As an example of many, on March 19, 2003, near the Iraqi desert in Kuwait, Associated Press reporter Ellen Nickmeyer illustrated the symbolic power of Indian wars as a source of U.S. military memory and practice. Tank crews from the Alpha Company, 4th Battalion, 64th Armored Regiment performed what they call a Seminole Indian war dance before convoying to a position near the Iraqi border. Captain Wolford's men leaped into the air and waved rifles in an impromptu war dance, desert war dance. He said to the reporter, "We will be entering Iraq as an army of liberation, not domination." The Seminole war dance is serious business. It's done a lot in the Army. The 3 declared wars against the Seminole Nation in Florida Everglades, the 3 declared wars that never seem to show up in U.S. history textbooks, span a 42-year period of time, the longest war in U.S. history, from 1816 to 1858. The Seminole Wars remain deeply embedded in the U.S. military tradition and practice. And it's not just ceremonial, as in that war dance. In early 2011, a Yemeni citizen, Ali Hamza al-Balu, was serving a life sentence at Guantanamo as an enemy combatant. A military tribunal having convicted him of crimes associated with his service to al-Qaeda as Osama bin Laden's media secretary. In arguing on appeal that Balul's conviction be upheld, a Pentagon lawyer, Navy Captain Edward S. White, relied on a precedent from an 1818 Army tribunal. In his 37-page military commission's brief, Captain White wrote, quote, "Not only was the Seminole belligerency unlawful, but much like modern-day al-Qaeda, the very way in which the Seminoles waged war against the U.S. targets, itself violate the customs and usages of war." The Center for Constitutional Rights objected to this passage in the government's brief, writing, "The court should reject the government's notable reliance on the Seminole Wars of the 1800s, a genocide that led to the Trail of Tears. The government's characterization of Native American resistance to the United States as much like modern-day al-Qaeda is not only factually wrong, but overtly racist, and cannot present any legitimate legal basis to uphold Mr. Balul's conviction." In response, the Pentagon's General Counsel issued a letter stating that the U.S. government stood by its precedent. So the Seminole Wars are still being fought. This isn't just history. So a little background to that case in 2011. Following the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, rather than bestowing the status of prisoner of war on Afghan detainees, which would have given them certain rights under the Geneva Convention, they were designated as unlawful combatants. And Most were interned at the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay and other places, secret sites around the world. We still don't know how many and where they were, all of them. As such, the detainees were subjected to torture by U.S. interrogators and shamelessly monitored by civilian psychologists and medical personnel. Much of the rhetoric following the declaration of the War on Terror after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 references U.S. American militaristic memory of the wars against Native nations. In response to questions and condemnations from around the globe, a University of California international law professor, John C. Yu, on leave to serve as Assistant U.S. Attorney General in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, penned in March 2003 what became the infamous torture memo. Despite strong objections to the unlawful combatant moniker, not much was made at the time of one of the precedents you employed to defend the designation unlawful combatant. This was the U.S. Supreme Court's 1873 opinion in Modoc Indian prisoners. In 1872, the Modoc leader, Kentuash, also known as Captain Jack, led some 150 of his people to return to their own country in Northern California after the U.S. Army had rounded them up and forced them to share a reservation with people they were unrelated to in Oregon. 53 insurgent fighters from this group were surrounded by the U.S. troops after they returned and the Oregon militia, and they were forced to take refuge in the barren and rugged lava beds around Lassen, a volcano lava bed, a part of their ancestral homeland that they knew every inch of, and it's also sacred land to them. More than 1,000 troops commanded by General Edward R.S. Canby, a former Civil War general, attempted to capture the resistors, but had no success as the Modocs engaged in effective guerrilla warfare. Before the Civil War, General Canby had built his military career fighting in the Second Seminole War and later in the invasion of Mexico in 1846. Posted to Utah on the eve of the Civil War, he had led attacks against the Navajos and then began his Civil War service in New Mexico. Therefore, Canby was a seasoned Indian killer. In negotiations between the general and Kentuash, the Modoc leader killed the general and the other commissioners when they would allow no resolution other than Modoc total surrender. In response, the Army Command dispatched another former Civil War general with more than 1,000 additional soldiers as reinforcements. And in April 1873, these troops attacked the Modoc stronghold in the lava beds, this time forcing the Modoc resistors to scatter. After 4 months of fighting that cost the United States near equal to $10 million today, and the lives of more than 400 of its soldiers and a general, the nationwide backlash against the Modocs was vengeful. Kentuash and several other captured Modocs, were captured, tried, and hanged at Alcatraz. And the Modoc families were scattered and incarcerated on reservations as far away as Oklahoma. Kentuash's corpse was embalmed and exhibited at circuses around the country. Drawing a legal analogy between the Modoc prisoners and the Guantanamo detainees, Assistant U.S. Attorney General Yu employed the legal category of homo sacer. In Roman law, homo sacer is a person banned from society, excluded from its legal protections, but still subject to the sovereign's power. Anyone may kill a homo sacer without it being considered murder. To buttress his claim that the detainees could be denied prisoner of war status, you quoted from the 1873 Modoc Indian prisoner's opinion, which read in part, all the laws and customs of civilized warfare may not be applicable to an armed conflict with the Indian tribes upon our western frontiers. Thereby, anyone could be defined as Indian. Anyone who could be defined as Indian could be tortured or killed legally. And they could also be held criminally responsible for engaging any U.S. soldier. The U.S. military established a pattern during and after the Vietnam War of forcibly removing indigenous peoples from sites deemed strategic for the placement of military bases. The peoples of the Bikini Atoll of the South Pacific and Puerto Rico's Vieques Island are perhaps the best known examples. But there were also the Inuit of Tuol, Greenland, who were relocated, and the thousands of Okinawans, Chamorros of Guam, indigenous peoples of Micronesia, and the Chagosian people of Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean. During the harsh deportation of the Micronesians in the 1970s, the press took some notice. In response to one reporter's question, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said of the Micronesians, there are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn? This is a statement of permissive genocide. By the beginning of the 21st century, the United States operated more than 900 military bases around the world, not counting all the ones in the United States, Puerto Rico, including 287 in Germany, 130 in Japan, 106 in South Korea, 89 in Italy, 57 in the British Isles, 21 in Portugal, and 19 in Turkey. The number also comprised additional bases or installations located in Aruba, Australia, Djibouti, Egypt, Israel, Singapore, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, Crete, Sicily, Iceland, Romania, Bulgaria, Honduras, Colombia, and Cuba at Guantanamo Bay, among many other locations in some 150 countries, along with those recently added in Iraq and Afghanistan. We see the military all around us and in the media. We kind of take it for granted that it's benign. But as military historian John Grenier notes, the U.S. militarization is not new. It has deep historical roots, reaching into the nation's Anglo-settler past and continuing through unrelenting wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing over 3 centuries. Grenier writes, quote, beyond its sheer military utility, Americans also find a use for the first way of war in the construction of an American identity. I'd add that the astronomical, and I think Denver's an important place to, as many are these days, to say this astronomical number of firearms owned by U.S. civilians, with the Second Amendment as a sacred mandate, is also intricately related to militaristic culture. The militias referred to in the Second Amendment are those civilians who were mobilized to attack indigenous towns, burning their fields to take their land. Everyday life and the culture in general are damaged by ramped up militarization. And this includes academia, particularly the social sciences, with psychologists and anthropologists being recruited as advisors to the military. Anthropologist David H. Price, in his indispensable book I highly recommend, Weaponizing Anthropology, remarks that, quote, anthropology has always fed between the lines of war. Anthropology was born of European and U.S. colonial wars. Price sees an accelerated pace of militarization in the early 21st century. Quoting Price, today's weaponization of anthropology and other social sciences has been a long time coming, and post-9/11 America's cultural climate of fear, coupled with reductions in traditional academic funding, provided the conditions of a sort of perfect storm for the militarization of the discipline and the academy as a whole. So going back to Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird, this book, by the way, I highly recommend, The Transit of Empire. It's a book 3 years ago it was published. It's an amazing book. Jody writes, the story of the New World is horror, the story of America a crime. Every time I read that line, I have an image of someone doing, it would take a lot of people doing it actually, an art installation. A huge project of putting yellow tape around the whole borders of the United States. It's a crime scene. It is necessary to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent. These origins contain the historical seeds of genocide. Any true history of the United States must focus on what happened to and with indigenous peoples and what still happens to them. That is, if we wish to understand the present and change it, we have to know that this past is the present. A race to innocent is what occurs when individuals assume they are innocent of complicity in structures of domination and oppression. This concept captures the understandable assumption made by, say, new immigrants or children of recent immigrants to any country. They cannot be responsible, they assume, for what occurred in their adopted country's past. Yet in a settler society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma was entailed in settling the land affects the assumptions and behavior of living generations of any given time, including immigrants and the children of recent immigrants. We need to make immigrants and refugees and their children and the children of immigrants and refugees understand this colonialist past that exists, that this is what they're joining. And if they have a choice of becoming a settler or having the settler state of mind, embracing militaristic patriotism or not. Another aspect of the demand for U.S. dominion is a ghoulish one that appears under the guise of science. Despite the passage in 1990 of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, some researchers under the cloak of science have fought tooth and nail not to release the remains and burial offerings of some 2 million indigenous people held in storage, much of it uncatalogued. In the Smithsonian Institution and other museums and by universities, state historical societies, National Park Service offices, warehouses, and curio shops. Until the 1990s, archaeologists and physical anthropologists claimed to need these remains, which they labeled resources or data, but rarely as human remains. They claimed they needed them for purported scientific experimentation, but most were randomly stored in boxes, in storage spaces. The whole Smithsonian Institution attic of the old building is filled with these boxes. of Indian human remains. In doing so, they also challenged the definition of Native American and the claimant's right to sovereignty. They even accused Native Americans of being anti-science for seeking to repatriate the remains of their ancestors. However, since anthropologist Franz Boas in 1911 discredited the theories of racial superiority and inferiority upon which such research was premised, little actual examination of the indigenous body parts has taken place. When Ishi, identified by Anglos in 1911 as the last of the Yahi people of Northern California, when he died in 1916, the U.S. Berkeley anthropologist who had studied him and his culture, Arthur Kroeber, insisted on an indigenous traditional burial and no autopsy, according to Ishi's wishes. When asked about the cause of science, Kroeber said, "If there is any talk about the interest of science, say for me that science can go to hell. Besides, I cannot believe that any scientific value is materially involved. We have hundreds of Indian skeletons that nobody ever comes to study." Despite Kroeber's stance, Ishi's brain was removed and preserved and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. As anthropologist Eric Davis observes, the bodies have never had scientific value. Rather, they have become a fetish, a marker of value, the power of which derives specifically from the obscuring of the referent to which it originally referred. Davis claims that Indian identity and its material form, the dead native body, has functioned for a very long time and with increasing power as a fetish, as war trophies marking the possession of land by those who have conquered it already. So we must ask, how then can U.S. society come to terms with its past and change direction for the future? How can it acknowledge responsibility? The late Native historian Jack Forbes always stressed that while living persons are not responsible for what their ancestors did, they are responsible for the society they live in, which is a product of that past. Assuming this responsibility provides a means of survival and liberation, not just for Native people. Everyone and everything in the world is affected, for the most part negatively, by U.S. dominance and intervention, often violently through direct military means or through proxies. It must be an urgent concern and priority if humanity is to survive. And indigenous peoples offer possibilities for life after empire, possibilities that neither erase the crimes of colonialism nor require the disappearance of the original peoples colonized under the guise of including them as individuals through assimilation. That process rightfully starts by honoring the treaties the United States made with indigenous nations, by restoring all sacred sites, starting with the Black Hills, the Hahasaka of the Sioux, and including most federally held parks and land, and all stolen sacred items and human remains, and by payment of sufficient reparations for the reconstruction and expansion of Native nations. In the process, the continent will be radically reconfigured, physically and psychologically. For the future to be realized, it will require extensive educational programs and the full support and active participation of the descendants of settlers, enslaved Africans, and colonized Mexicans, as well as immigrant populations. Again, in the words of Acoma poet Simon Ortiz from his book of poetry on the Sand Creek Massacre, "The future will not be mad with loss and waste, though the memory will be there. Eyes will become kind and deep, and the bones of this nation will mend after the revolution."
thank you very much. Although we met for the first time this evening, I'm delighted to find a kindred spirit. Danny, thank you so much for recommending your friend and colleague for our opening. I teach a number of standalone courses on things like forced labor and human trafficking, another one on torture, another on international humanitarian law on conflict and war. I see them as interconnected, and most see them as very disparate topics. So I'm always very appreciative of someone who knows how to connect the dots between the past and the present, between different disciplines. I think, unfortunately, even here at Korbel, we operate under silos. We have 5-degree programs, and students and faculty tend to stick with those. It's fairly classic here as the director of the Human Rights degree program. I see that human rights students and security students rarely intermix, talk to each other, though there are wonderful few exceptions. And instead of talking about human rights and national security, maybe we should be talking about human security. But that has yet to happen, even though we clearly have the resources. I also want to thank you for raising 2 notorious figures for me. John Yoo, and some of my students here know that I have considered John Yoo to be my personal nemesis, and that I would gladly give up my entire career to have the chance to prosecute Henry Kissinger for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
He doesn't travel.
He can't because there are warrants out for his arrest in many places. So I thank you very much for making us see the connection between what we tend to think are separate pieces, and we're not very good at connecting these dots and seeing that it's a part of a continuous whole. So I'll have more time to talk to you privately, so I just want to open it up if you're willing to take some questions. I also, as I mentioned, the book, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, is available in the back. I would encourage you to read it. And I hope at the end of this evening that the DU bookstore will have no copies left to take back, so that I will encourage you to do that. And I know they take credit cards because they just took mine, so take yours as well, because I know nobody carries cash. So if all right with you, I'd like to open this up for questions. And if you want to make a comment, try to not be too terribly polemic about the process, but comments are okay as well. Yes.
Hi, my name is Nanny Bishop. I'm the science engineering librarian here, just started, but I'm not going to open FEMA. And this is really interesting, so many points that you brought up. I wanted to ask you about education in the United States, because you brought it up and you're an educator yourself. How do you think the United States as a nation can change its curriculum or history of past through education in bringing all the points that you brought to face value for the future? Because I feel like you can't change anything about the future unless you educate the next generation.
Thank you. That's, I think we have to think of education as formal and informal, and families. Education is all around us. So if we think of it strictly as what we're seeing as these resistance to even the slightest mention of a problem with U.S. history has driven everything, to the worst. It would be really difficult, I think, to be a public high school or middle school history teacher these days. But of course, I know a lot of teachers. It's different in the university where you can do and say anything you want, use any book you want. But by the time the students get there, and of course most don't get there, and they have, sometimes dubious education when they do, because at least in my field, history is very, reluctant to give up some things, some narratives. And so I think we have to think about it as how we who are engaged in education, in human rights, in social justice activities, how do we set up programs in the community, even on campus, the campus community outside the classroom? How can public school teachers find ways of teaching against the text? How to train them to do that? I believe I could train people to train people, because when I first started teaching Native American studies in 1974, and a brand new, that's just when Native American studies programs were getting started. The first one really started in '68 at UCLA. Vine DeVoria set it up, but it was mainly around law. And it was very good, but we were just getting it in the state universities with the students having revolted and demanded ethnic studies, closing down campuses. That's how we got it. It wasn't handed over. And mostly we've had to fight for keeping it ever since, everywhere we've gotten it. And I can tell you east of Mississippi, it doesn't even exist at all. It's weird to go on a book tour back east with this book. Because I'm talking about them, I always make sure I read the chapters about, the West that's in the East, and they don't know that history at all. It is really disturbing. Law professors, people with PhDs, I'm not talking about, people in the community. So it's really difficult. When I started out, all we had really were N.G. DuBose. The only good books were N.G. DuBose books, which were mostly about Oklahoma. Later, she did one on the Apaches after that, but mainly the Geronimo Apaches at Fort Sill. So I had to use books that and texts and papers that I disagreed with. And I taught critical thinking. How do you take this material? Because there's a wealth of material in any history textbook or any history book. It's the interpretation. And if you can find, a way, it became my favorite way of teaching. So when really good texts came out, I sort of would stick with having the students do a study of textbooks themselves. To choose a textbook, go through it from what they learned in the course, they're learning from their other readings, and critique that textbook, say the one they used in high school or that their little brother or sister is using right now. So the other thing we can do is, like I say, community, I should say, I'm speaking at one of them, but two colleagues at San Francisco State University from Ethnic Studies has set up a community course on the 60th anniversary of Bandung. You all know what Bandung is, right? The founding of the non-aligned movement, the Third World Liberation Movement, 1955. And this is something most people don't know very much about. It's been forgotten. It's just history, but actually there's some very important things there that are useful in the present. So I'll be giving one talk there, but they had their first session last night. And I couldn't go because I was preparing to come here, but I received messages this morning. They had space for 50 people and 300 people showed up. Wow. All of them just people from the community in San Francisco from the Mission District. The place is located in the Mission District. So they're going to have to get a bigger place. And that's really encouraging. People are really hungry for information. And the way people responded to this book, it's already being used in classes. I didn't expect it to be. The publisher didn't, because it's a hardback and the paperback won't be out until this August. But it got snapped up, so much so that since it was published in September, it's gone through 6 printings. The hardback has gone through 6 printings. We kept running out in the fall. There was a 2-week period of time we had no books at all. Amazon had no books. And it's really hard to figure out why exactly, except that I'm thinking this book, it wouldn't have happened, if I'd written the same book and it came out 10 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. There's something, people really are searching now. So I think all of us should be optimistic in that sense and do go into overdrive trying to make things available, you know, make material available. And of course, the internet is a godsend as far as I'm concerned, whatever its negative aspects are. It's so, I found out that Danny Postad is here in Denver through Facebook, his Facebook page. I didn't know, I thought he was still in Chicago. So I think, yeah, I think we have to just all think about everything we do, and churches are a really great place, and congregations. I've been invited, I've spoken, you know, since September in hundreds of places, in churches, chambers of commerce, universities, public schools, public libraries, city council once, and I go anywhere I'm invited. You know, I decided this is, okay, any invitation I get anywhere, as long as they'll pay my way there. In some cases, they don't even pay my way there. I decided it's worth doing. And because I don't know how long it will last, you know, this opening. So I think, you know, I'm older than most of you here, and as you get older, you become aware that, well, like in the 60s, we thought that would just go on forever. You know, we're not conscious that things open, there's a surge, and then there's a clampdown. So it's really important. What gets learned usually is permanent, you know, for those few, you know, a really small percentage. We came to realize, I mean, at a certain, you know, we thought everyone was with us, and yet up until people figured out Vietnam wasn't going to be won, 70% of the American public were supporting the Vietnam War. I mean, now we don't have hardly anyone supporting these wars, but we have this kind of insidious thing of, you know, supporting the troops, and we have to examine that. So, yeah, education's really important, and to just think of it as a full-time occupation. You're every waking moment with your children, with your neighbors, and with your, to talk about things. I remember right after 9/11, in the building I was living in, everyone in that building were, you know, they were tech, mostly tech people. They had no political notions. They were, you know, I become friends with my neighbors. I don't have to have everyone having my same politics or anything, but they knew I was a very political person. They would see the kind of people that came to visit me, and the sounds of many people meeting in my apartment many times. And so they all came to me and asked me, literally asked me, why do they hate us, Roxanne? So I sat them down and told them why they hate us. But I don't think many people were doing that. You know, there was that opening right after 9/11 that the first thing people thought about is we're doing something to make people really mad. And so there was this crackdown on that. Poor Susan Sontag, and, you know, got bashed. Anyone, Bill Maher got fired from his program. It's, you know, it was really clamped down, but had many of us, right all, sat down, and whoever asked that question said, let me explain some things to you. That sticks, you know, so when the clampdown comes, there's that stickiness that's there. You can't unlearn something once you learn it. That's the really important thing to remember. There's no going back, even if you want to. You can go crazy. You can kill yourself, or you can become a drug addict, but you can't really go back to what you thought before. And that's a beautiful thing about education and learning.
It's great to hear of all these different openings.
If you want to use a microphone, you're welcome to.
I'll just try to speak up. It's great to hear of all these different openings and opportunities. And you mentioned even with our children, and there are some great children's books featuring Indigenous people. And there's a children's book that's in English and Navajo with a CD as well to try to resurrect Indigenous languages. But I also want to keep in mind what we're up against. You mentioned Robert Kaplan, one of the intellectual boosters. I heard him on AM Talk Radio, one of the large 50,000 watt stations. So there's that giant platform that they're reaching, but there's also some progressive radio that's recently developed where there's some openings, and they'll have people like Winona LaDuke on at times. And and there's also social media. I found out about this talk and this wonderful organization through Facebook, and I want to thank the organizers. And I'm actually a Facebook buddy of yours, and I get a lot out of your page. And so thank you so much for what you're up to.
That's a really good point about those, radio station, not, go on. I've been interviewed for hundreds of radio stations, on phone interviews, and it's amazing. They let you talk because they don't quite know what to say in response, In 2001, I went on Hannity and Combs and Bill O'Reilly and Fox Morning Show, Fox and Friends. I had cable, but I didn't know about Fox TV. That's how much I use my TV for movies. And so I knew it was right wing, when I got a call to go on, because I had set up a course at my university. They asked me to, the dean said, there's this demand that's coming from the community, and all the students, they want something that will explain terrorism and 9/11. So I said, okay, I'll teach an online course. I'm really glad I chose to teach an online course, because I didn't want to come to campus for another course in the spring of 2002. And so it got in the program, into the schedule in November of 2001, right when the invasion of Afghanistan was going on. And the course I decided to teach, I decided to do it in women's studies, not in ethnic studies. I called it The Sexuality of Terrorism, which is the name of Robin Morgan's book from, 1983 or so. It's long been out of print. But then I found out a new edition was coming out, because that title seemed like it would sell again, and I didn't agree with a lot of her arguments in the book, but I did think that it got to something that, at least the title, and I would use your book and develop critical thinking. Anyway, that course got in the program, and this is the power of the internet, which I wasn't really, I was using the internet, but I didn't realize it was so widespread already. Because I think at that time we only had that one server, I can't even remember what it's called, Netscape, no, what was it called? Something, that the assistant to the president called me and asked me if I wanted to have, the public relations person in the president's office. He said, we have a lot of letters here to us, not to you, but talking about you and the course you're going to do in the spring. And they're really pretty nasty. Do you want me to send them over or put them in the trash? He obviously was not. And I said, oh, send them over. I just didn't read it. Well, that's what I was really glad it was an online course, I tell you, because I wouldn't have wanted to be in the classroom. People actually even sent me powdered stuff, it was, you know, and there was a security guard outside our department. And right, you know, starting right then, because, and I couldn't figure out how on earth they knew about, you know, anyone knew about this course at this, you know, pretty small state university out of 23 campuses of state universities in California. This one course somehow had caught the attention of people from all over the country. We said, how did that happen? And so I found out, I actually got one positive letter. And there was a phone number, and I called this person and I said, do you know, how did you know about this course? And he said, because I didn't think people went scrolling through, you know, programs or women's studies at Cal State Hayward. You know. I was getting a little paranoid. He said, well, it was in the Wall Street Journal, in the stupidest things of the week, a little bit that they used to have before Murdoch. But, you know, it's on the opinion page, which has always been very right-wing, the Wall Street Journal. And it was just a few lines, he said, saying this course, and that's what people had read. And then that got the phone call started with Fox News calling me to come on. So I went down to the studios in San Francisco, you know, they have a distant studio for Fox there. And I went on Fox and Friends first, and that woman who's still on there, I can't remember her name, she was so baffled by what I was saying that she just let me talk. I talked for 10 minutes, nonstop. I just said, talk. And so, of course, Bill O'Reilly and you know, must have come to the attention of the ALES people, because then the two biggies called to interview me. And what they did was, when they had me on, they wouldn't let me talk. They talked over me, yelling at me. Even Combs, the liberal, was yelling at me. And so my daughter was watching it on TV. I made her watch it and tape it. And she said underneath, they were running this ticker tape kind of thing. Sexual pervert hates Americans, or you know, something like that. It was ridiculous. So I don't think I got over to too many people in the Fox, except that Fox morning show. But I did get on a lot of, you know, I got a lot of calls from right-wing radio stations, like these 50, you know, these huge ones. And I went on those radio shows. And when I got a chance to, they were mostly in the South, it seemed like. And I would start with talking about my background, you know, growing up rural in Oklahoma, and my dad was a rodeo man, and so these people were kind of, you know, I know the South because I know Oklahoma, and if there's a bond of some sort, a similarity, then you can say a lot of things that they won't agree with, but they'll be polite to you, you know. And so I got by with that with quite a few of these interviews. I got to large audiences, was able to say a lot. Because, well, again, they were a little baffled, but they also were respectful once I would say who I was.
Yeah, I have to ask you a question. You started off talking about culture based on consumption, and you also titled initially the survival of the United States and the world. I was wondering if you're familiar with Russell Means' speech for Europe to survive, for the world to survive, Europe must die. And this whole concept of a consumer-based culture and the crisis that we're entering now, both the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of the climate, and how indigenous worldviews are being looked at as a potential way out for us. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, if you could.
Yeah, of course I remember Russell's speech, and I think it's it's the clarion call of International Indigenous Peoples Movement, which is, in the leadership really of the climate convergence. We saw that I saw it in New York in September. It's this amazing leadership of Native people from North America, Canada, US, but also, from Ecuador and Amazonia and Bolivia. That, I try to, in this book, I try to show there's a difference between civilization per se and how Europe developed. I have a chapter in that book called The Culture of Conquest that goes into the development of Europe. I do think, and I also have a chapter on Follow the Corn, which is the way Native people in the Americas were developing in the Caribbean before colonialism. And I do think that capitalism wasn't inevitable. That these things, the Crusades in particular, and especially in Spain, that created the colonial institutions, and of course the introduction of African slavery in 1454 through a papal bull that gave Portugal the right to go and take slaves in West Africa, to occupy the place and take the people as slaves. This was something different, something new. Of course, it was the dawn of capitalism, but that had to go through accumulation. And because it was first based on gold, that quest for gold, I think it took humanity in a direction that it wasn't necessary to go in. And that in the Americas, something else was happening that got interrupted, got halted. And yes, there were these great civilizations like Coquia and the Inca and the Aztec, the Toltecs before that. But if you really break that down, break it apart, there were also corrections taking place. I studied New Mexico intensely, the Pueblo Indians, and they were at Mesa Verde. They had a huge civilization. They had irrigation, incredible, intricate, 100 miles long irrigation, waterproof, 20 feet in diameter. They had denuded the whole place, built with wood, and their huge multi-storied structures. The bones were made of wood. It's a semi-arid place. They made the place uninhabitable. What did they do? Instead of continuing and developing the technology to survive inhabitable places, like California raising rice in a desert, they moved. They moved to the Rio Grande Valley, a natural source of water. They rebuilt their civilization, but in 98 autonomous city-states, and developed a whole different way of life. And I think that's what would have happened in Mexico. Cortez came right when the rebellion was widespread and imminent. And they were able to seemingly ally. And this becomes then a template for colonialism. This is how the US entered Cuba, occupied Cuba and the Philippines, by going when they were revolting against the Spanish Empire, infiltrating that revolt, and then crushing it and occupying. And so I do think that there's enough knowledge that has been handed down, practices and knowledge from Native peoples in the Western Hemisphere that, and I would include the Pacific, of course, that can inform us for how to build a future. Civilization that is not, doesn't destroy the earth. If we could ever, we could spend, I think, if we started now, it would take about 2 centuries to restore. That would be a big occupation. Everyone would be employed, let me tell you, just restoring the ecology of the earth. So, yeah, I think that European colonialism is still with us. You know, John Trudell says that he calls it the 500-year Reich, and sees Hitler even as a moment of the 500-year Reich that started with 1492. And now it would be, of course, more going into the 600-year Reich. That is something special. And I think we just have to stop looking at history as progress and go back and look at that moment of that direction taken by a part of humanity that then came to dominate the world as not progress, but a diversion from the role of human beings in the web of everything. You know, we're here to remake things, but to protect things, keep ourselves alive by remaking nature, but remaking it so that the habitat survives, because you don't survive without the habitat. So I think it's not mystery knowledge. I think it's just that this revival of languages, a revival of native cultures all over the hemisphere, is really, really important. Needs to be supported in every way possible. Because governments, except in Bolivia, there's a lot of support going on, but other governments in the hemisphere probably are not going to support it except in a perverted way for their own purposes of assimilation or whatever. And it's got to come from, but not just the native people, from everyone getting tuned into how a future could look. And because we don't have many examples in human history, because they got cut off. Amilcar Cabral, the liberation leader of Guinea-Bissau, he said what colonialism did was stop history. Stop the history, the trajectory of history of where the people would have gone. So if we go and we look back, what was there? What are the threads that could be reconstructed now, with the world as we have it now? And I think we can come up with we could just get some of these tech people tuned in to creating, technological possibilities for some of these things would be important. Educate the techs. I live in the middle of Silicon Valley.
I just had a comment on that. I went to the University of Washington for my master's in library and information science, and I lived in tech culture in Seattle, but I'm from Arizona and I'm half native, and I kind of was trying to get my colleagues and peers to understand that not everywhere in the United States has the internet. Not everywhere in the United States has electricity. Not everywhere in the United States has lights or water. And my peers just didn't understand that. Like, I would speak up and say, hey, we don't need this. But I had one professor there who was very, very high-tech at the beginning of my quarters there. And by the end, when I graduated, he had shifted his research to mindfulness and more about information overload and how technology is bad. And it was totally eye-opening for me to see one professor go from his class of technology and I must learn their ways of doing things, to him listening to me and saying, I'm going to look at your way of thinking and how that can be research. And the whole aspect of research was not accepted of indigenous knowledges or ways of living, and I wanted my research proposals to be on native way of life, and I called it living libraries. And so I focused on my grandparents and oral histories and things like this that is well recognized in libraries and museums as research and as a whole field in itself. And I tried to get that to be understood among my peers, my own age group, that living libraries it's not books or technology that's going to give us the future. It's going to be our elders and our grandparents and parents telling us what they've experienced, so it's going to help us build the future. And so it was a whole mindset shift of things. And I wanted to ask you, how do you teach the sovereign and the sacred to folks that are not a part of that culture? Because that was my hardest point of getting folks to understand, was they would ask me about things or ceremonies and things, and I've attended lots of different friends of mine's ceremonies and different things like that, but I didn't feel comfortable or wasn't going to share with them the details of the sacred because that wasn't my prerogative to teach them. And so how do you teach the sovereign and the sacred and get them to understand that when they can't be a part of that? And that was kind of, that's where, and people ask me about writing and can non-Native authors write fiction about Native people? And I'm a part of the American Indian Library Association, and I fight against that. I fight against authors writing fiction about Natives that's just so damaging to me and my children. So how do you teach the sovereign and the sacred? How do you get these authors and white literary publishers to understand that field of sovereign and sacred and what they're doing wrong?
Yeah, well, like I said about the East Coast, where all the publishers are, they, it's really difficult because we've seen what New Age things do, the kind of perversion of appropriation. It's not a matter of appropriation, it's a matter of learning to think. I don't know, I've been reading a lot of Hannah Arendt lately. It's like just learning to think, because we don't think very much. Native Americans think a lot, you know. I mean, to survive genocide, you really, over centuries, generation to generation, you have to really either obliterate your mind entirely, which unfortunately happens a lot under colonialism, or you have to be smarter than everyone else to survive. And Native people are smarter than anyone else, really. But to be able to learn, you know, the basics, like not a ceremony, but what the land is. People have learned a lot through, you know, understanding the environment. And I don't think enough credit is given to how the environmental movement came about through the resurgence of Native resurgence in the 50s and 60s. Thomas Banyaka, David Monyanke, and Leon Shenandoah were present at Stockholm in 1972 at the first UN Environmental Conference. They're the first people I heard. I get this idea from Thomas Banyaka of because they had their prophecy, the Hopi prophecy, these drawings in caves, and they say, you know, here's where things went wrong. They kind of date it, you know, to 1492, went in that direction, way off path, dragging the rest of the world with it. And then still this path is there. It's just getting overwhelmed. There's still time, they were saying in the 70s, to jump over, you know, and get on that path, get on the red road. And I think if you explain that to people, it's in their interests, you know. They don't necessarily have to do the ceremony, just think about it, think about their children, think about, you know, humanize themselves. I guess now, you know, I think I started calling it indigenize everyone. That is, you know, people who are not indigenous to this land have never been comfortable in it. And even when they come to respect the environment or become environmentalists, it's sort of like it's supposed to be empty, you know, without people, and pristine, and so they can go hiking in it. You know, I mean, it's a very elitist kind of concept, and they're usually pretty well off, and you know, don't have to worry about getting water and food and so forth. So it can't just be that kind of that kind of ephemeral things, but down to earth things like where does food come from? Where does, should you really be raising a water crop, rice, in California? California is the largest rice producer in the world. If it were a country, #1 in the world. #1. Southeast Asia used to be #1 until the Vietnam War. And it's raised in a desert. In a desert, and we have a drought in California. We have droughts all the time, but now, you know, the aquifer has always provided the backup. Now the aquifer is practically empty. And what is there is getting poisoned by fracking. And nothing is being done about it, despite Jerry Brown's mumblings, you know, about it. Nothing is really being done about it. It's going to be a wasteland. And it's just got to stop. Commercial agriculture really has to be done away with. Commercial animal, you know, stock raising. They've destroyed half of the Amazon for grazing cows, for the beef here in Argentina. They must consume a great deal of it themselves, but cattle need to be phased out completely. And you know, there are concrete things that say, make that your goal. Do this one thing. Campaign. Join the campaign. There's already a campaign of animal rights. I think animal rights is something that has developed that I have a lot of respect for as a concept of rights. You know, that it's something I've learned. I actually learned from a student of mine who was in PETA and wrote her paper in a course I taught on feminist theory that it's impossible to be a feminist without being an animal rights person. And I thought, this is pretty extreme. But I read it and I said, and I became a vegan, and I still am a vegan. And so I think there's, you know, and this was a young white woman, but she had gotten her knowledge, you know, this store of knowledge that's coming out. And the indigenous movement in the 60s and 70s, with the seizure of Alcatraz, with Wounded Knee, with all of the fish-ins and the presence, you know, the visibility, it did a lot of good. And a lot of that still exists, but it's not still happening, you know. So it has to be, I mean, Native people are as active as they were in the 60s, but there's no headlines, you know, about it as there was with Alcatraz. It just goes, I mean, they're in the leadership of blocking the Keystone Pipeline, the tar sands in Canada. You go up there and yeah, there's the Cowboy and Indian Alliance, but mostly it's Indians. The Rosebud Sioux, or you know, the tribal council is saying this will not go through here. And it's very unusual for Indian Reorganization Act tribal council to take such a stand. The Lummi in Washington, same thing. Blocking a gas plant they want to put, a company wants to put next to their reservation, not their land base, because a lot of that was taken away, but it would affect them and affect their water. So all of these things are going on. I don't even know them. I didn't know that about Lummi until last fall when I was invited to the Northwest Indian College to speak, which is in the Lummi Reservation. I learned it, you know, because it's not in the papers. It's not always even in Indian country today. So, you know, we've got to find ways to disseminate the information of what's going on for multipliers, you know, of support for these things that are already going on and just aren't getting attention. I think we're past the day. I think we milked it pretty dry in the 60s when TV was new, that we can use agitprop as a means of organizing. We've really got to go door to door.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I'm Dale Rothman. I'm on the faculty here at Corbell. A lot of what you've been saying has been interesting because I was just involved in sort of an online dialogue very briefly that was looking at, from the environmental perspective, a lot of things we know we need to change. And I mean, this suffers in some ways from a lack of indigenous input, but there are people in various places who are involved in this. And a big question becomes is sort of what you were just hinting at is sort of how do you get the knowledge out and how do you sort of scale it up? Because we are, in a sense, fighting against powerful forces. There are a lot of people for whom, at least in the short run, the kind of civilization, the kind of development that we've had is beneficial for a lot of people in the short run. It's almost like, how do you convince people that the disruption that they might see of their current life and lifestyle is going to lead to something better? And I'm not sure, general thoughts you have on that.
No, that's a hard part because, well, what I saw in the 60s is, and in myself, because I didn't come from I'm not a red diaper baby. I didn't come from a political background. I grew up, with knowing 100 people and not even knowing the Holocaust had happened. I knew World War II happened, but I thought it was in Japan. And, I mean, just with no knowledge whatsoever of anything. And neither of my parents had gone farther than the 8th grade in school. And most of the people around us, and the preacher was the oracle, the Baptist preacher was the oracle, and whatever he said was true. So I guess that background gives me a lot of faith that people can not only learn, but be liberated. That it's liberation, it's not a burden, it's like coming out of a fog. And I feel, I've tried to trace, I've actually written 3 memoirs trying to trace and show the mechanisms that happened to me. Most of them seemingly accidental, just fortuitous. People who, I guess, you can tell when, most young people are very receptive to learning things. I don't think I was unusual in that sense, and they don't know very much. I tell my ignorance, but I tell you, there are a lot of young people today, even middle class, who probably don't know, maybe they know the word Holocaust, but they don't know what it was. They don't know they're Indians, they don't know, they don't know anything. But that doesn't mean they're stupid. It means that the problem in the United States too is that we are such an arrogant settler state that there is this tendency to think we know everything. And that includes a lot of professors, at least that I had at university in history. They didn't know everything. And today they don't, they don't connect up. The whole Civil War story that I tell in this book is never told in the Civil War by the Civil War historians. What was happening, everything that was happening, even though some of these things were being investigated by the Civil War, under civil guise of the Civil War. And even though all of those Union generals, all of them, still alive and of age, went straight out to the plains for the continuation, never did end, but for the ramped up, destruction of the people of the plains and the Navajo and Apache. So I think that if we present, if we really challenge people and be more, bring up things and not just be sociable all the time, bring up actual things that, especially with young people, they don't want to be made to feel they're stupid because they don't know something. I don't think there's any reason in the world that any kid in the United States who's not Native American should know one thing about Native Americans. And if they do know something, it's usually worse because it's not the truth. It's not true. So, that's not their fault. I mean, how are they supposed to know? Just how are they supposed to know? And that's what they grew up to be adults not knowing, and they go all their lives then not knowing anything about the history of this country, anything of importance of the history of this country. And yet they think they know. They've gone to school. They have PhDs. They have law degrees. They're medical doctors. They're professionals. So they know everything. And I think that's the hardest thing to break through. So I usually fall back on my working class background to say, I think, the ordinary people probably who we should focus on. Number one, they're more numerous. They're the majority. And number two, they don't think they know so much. In fact, they mostly feel that they don't know anything and they're confused and they don't want to know. And those people who have knowledge are just elitists. And then they get, filled with falsifications of everything. It's, you read these statistics of how many people believe Obama was born in Kenya and was, Manchurian candidate, brought over to overthrow the US government. It's just, it's shocking. It's like 25% of people. And then, the climate and everything. So we have a big task here. And I know from being an activist in the 60s that we didn't know much then either. We didn't know then what we know now. So we didn't do a lot of the necessary things that would put us in a different place now and made us much more vulnerable to being marginalized and, have your own little thing. You can have free speech. It doesn't matter. No one's listening to you.
Well, thank you so very, very much for this evening. Again, the book will be back and you're willing to sign? Yes?
Yes, and also I'm going to be here at both sessions tomorrow. I'm anxious to come, so before and after, I'd be glad to talk.
So I somehow I was remembered back at the height of when everyone seemed, I was living in Tucson, Arizona, and everybody, there was a lot of wannabes, and everybody wanted to be a Hopi at that time. I was having a long discussion with an old friend of mine, Emery Sika Kwaptewa, and talking about this issue about what do you do with all these Anglos who want Hopis. And he said, it's very easy. Anybody can be a Hopi. All you have to do is come to Second Mesa and grow corn for 20 years. So I leave you with that to think about. So again, thank you, Rebecca, so very much.